Hi, I'm Maddy Alcala, the president of Gooten. We're a global print-on-demand software solution built for the largest retailers and marketplaces in the world, and we just raised our $11 million Series A.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in and welcome to the Fundraising Debrief, the podcast where we share the real stories behind successful founders and the recent VC financing rounds. My name is Vlad Cazacu and I'll be your host today as we interview Maddy Alcala. This is a very unique episode showcasing the story of a round raised not by one of the original founders. Maddy quickly raised through the ranks and became the president of the organization, leading the fundraising efforts on a very tight deadline. She was expecting her newborn. You won't want to miss her insights. For more information about running a successful fundraise, including show notes, highlight clips, and exclusive scenes, follow us on Twitter and Instagram at The Fundraising Debrief, as well as our website at thefundraisingdebrief.com. This episode is brought to you by Flowlie, the number one choice for secure deck sharing and fundraising automation used by thousands of founders from 50 plus different countries. Now, let's dive right in. Maddy, such a pleasure to have you live on the podcast. Really excited for the conversation today.
Thank you. Me too. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
There's been quite an exciting journey you had at Gooten, and I think we can unpack a lot of insights here, maybe in a little bit more untraditional path into fundraising, in the sense of not starting a company, but becoming the leader of an organization later on, and then leading that organization to a successful fundraise. So before we even get there, I would love to start with a little bit of understanding of you and Gooten for everybody who didn't get the chance to know more about it. What do you do?
Yeah, well, thanks for the lead-in. Interesting is definitely one way to put it. My life is never dull here at Gooten, which is a good thing. But yes, as you mentioned, I joined the company a little over 6 years ago, and I was actually the first customer success rep at the business. So walked in, CEO Brian, who's still with the business, gave me a download of our customers at the time, like a Excel spreadsheet of about a couple hundred different businesses, and said, nobody's doing anything with these accounts. Go crazy, see what you can make of them. And so I essentially started there in terms of building out our growth team. So went from about a couple hundred customers on our platform up to over 10,000 businesses that we support today. And then in 2021, still had a pretty senior leadership position in our growth team in the company. And our board asked me to step into the role of president to lead fundraising and kind of really all of our external engagements. So I like to joke that fundraising is just sales with a different audience. So it's still a lot of like what I like to spend my time doing, which is kind of interacting with people external to the company and telling the story of how we solve problems for e-commerce businesses.
I love the combination between fundraising and sales. I think we're definitely going to lead in that a little bit later, but I'm curious to understand you moving into this role. Were you already knowing that you're going to fundraise before stepping into the role? Was fundraising something that happened afterwards? Just trying to unpack a little bit more about your journey into being thrown in the arena to start raising capital for a new business.
Yeah, it was really one of the reasons they asked me to step into the role was to lead fundraising. And so I knew that was going to be a big portion of my time is working with our board and our investor community, both current investors as well as hopefully finding new ones. Luckily, it wasn't a surprise. I think that would have been a really interesting way to start an already big position is learning that was going to be a component of my job without knowing it. So luckily, our board and our existing investors prepped me for that and kind of actually put me through a mini fundraising school before I kicked off the round. I was very fortunate to have some support from our board members and advisors who met with me weekly, destroyed the deck, played hardball, if you will, before I went live in front of new investors.
What was going on through your mind during that time, being asked to step in on as president, being asked to start leading fundraising for this company that you've been with a while, helped it grow? How did it feel?
I think nervous and excited. I like new experiences. I think that's part of my personality overall. And I think one of the coolest parts about working at a startup is there's always new experiences. And so there's never a dull moment. And so I thought of this opportunity as that this is a new, exciting experience. And I was really grateful for the board really taking the chance on me, but nervous as well. A lot of expectations, a lot of responsibility. I feel very much like I want to support the amount of support we've had in the business. And I take that seriously. And we've had great investor backers and a lot of people trust us along the way. And so I wanted to make sure that I stood up and represented the efforts of our team and everybody who's backed Gooten in a really positive light.
This is the fascinating part about this, and I think it's worth unpacking a little bit. There was trust that has been previously built, even maybe before you even joined the company in the first place, with a number of investors and board advisors, etc. and you're coming into this organization to fundraise with some things have already built, but also with a great opportunity to raise a new round. So I'm curious to understand a little bit more about that strategy coming in. What were some of the first things you've done with the existing board and the existing investors before jumping headfirst into raising new capital for the firm?
Yeah. So, Gooten, to your point, has existed for, I think our code's almost like our oldest code is 9 to 10 years old. The business has been around for a bit. Obviously, we've rebuilt the code since then. So the technology is very current, but the idea behind the product is about 10 years old, and we've had some legacy customers with us and partnerships for quite a long time. So it's always an interesting balance deciding and preserving the good of what you have versus coming in with a fresh perspective to say, what else can we do here? I think something that I've really focused on over my tenure has been setting a clear strategy for what we want to be when we grow up. And so that's a big project I took on in 2021 as well, is creating really the first strategy vision document for the business to say, what's our big, hairy, audacious goal? What do we want to be? What are those measures of success? And really rallying the business around that. Because I think we had tried to do that previously as a business, but it hadn't really stuck. And I think that's made a world of difference for us as we looked at what we're building from a product standpoint, what types of customers we want to acquire, and then frankly, the story that we tell to the market. And I think storytelling, sales, fundraising, that's a huge element of how we represent ourselves and bring people along with us. And so getting that story right and feeling really confident about it internally, I think has helped the business in so many ways, not just fundraising, of course.
Absolutely. And I would assume that getting that documented, that vision created before starting to have some of those investor conversations helped get the round closed in the time that it did. And I'm curious to understand from the round dynamics that you were observing in terms of old investors versus new investors, outreach to people who've already built that trust and interest in Gooten versus people who are brand new. How do you approach that?
Yeah, well, it's always easier talking to people that know you and trust you. And so I think those conversations tended to move quicker at the onset. As much as we had participation from existing investors in the round was led by new capital and new investors who'd never heard of Gooten before we started talking to them. It was definitely a balance, and there were a lot of rejections along the way, as I'm sure you've heard from other people in my position. Most VCs are looking for reasons to say no. And so we definitely heard a lot of no's in the process. And so I think that's a good opportunity to be resilient, but also to refine along the way. And that was one of the big things I learned as I'm talking to new people, especially ones that don't necessarily have that trust or understand that story yet, is some of the feedback not so helpful. But when you got helpful feedback, try to actually internalize it and then help you change your story so it can resonate the next time around.
Resilience is definitely the key word in that fundraising journey, and being accustomed to that probably from a partnerships and sales angle, maybe built a little bit of a thicker skin before jumping into the VC arena and hearing those no. But I'm curious to unpack, what was, in your opinion, the most common no? Why did people pass on Gooten at this stage?
Yeah, we had a lot of no's due to what I would call stage. So we're a little bit non-traditional because we've been around for a longer amount of time, but we were raising a Series A. So there were a lot of people that had a hard time wrapping their heads around, where do I put you in my kind of fund or investment thesis box of like, I make investments of this size or I make investments of this size with these types of companies. And so we did a lot better with funds who were more flexible in their investment approach in terms of check sizes, what types of businesses they work with, looking more at the market fit and the product and the traction versus really trying to put us in a specific container. I think the other big reason for our no is we're not pure SaaS. So we have a mix of transactional and subscription revenue, and a lot of VCs out there don't like anything other than SaaS, or at least that's what I was told.
And I can feel that you have certain opinions about it, but I'm curious to understand, do you believe in labels in VC, or do you believe that it's just a business transaction? So if you find a company that has the growth potential and the founders are right and the leadership is correct, we might as well back it. How do you view that?
I honestly think it depends. I think from my experience interacting with some of these funds, it is a business transaction, it's an investment, and that makes sense, right? They're looking at numbers and they may tell you they're looking at other things, but it's pretty clear through the process that's not actually underpinning the decision. I do think there's other funds that I've interacted with where there are other factors there that really weigh into their decision. And we move forward and ultimately closed a round with one of those funds that really invested in Gooten. Yes, we've had great traction and growth, but because of the strategy. But all of the other funds that we got farthest along with weren't actually because of our numbers. It was because of the belief in the market, understanding the product, and like a strong strategic conviction. And so I do think there are those types of funds out there. And frankly, those were the most fulfilling interactions on both sides, I think, where I got a lot out of that as well, even if it didn't lead to an executed term sheet.
And for the ones that were primarily focused on metrics, and feel free to answer this in any way, have you seen any changes over the last 12 months with the recent macroeconomic situation of the types of metrics they're looking for, the types of metrics that may have not been as relevant a year ago, and this reliance on, KPIs, and maybe the strategy is important, but not as much as what you have already proven to be able to do?
Yeah, I think, I've talked to other founders and people out there fundraising. A lot of what I saw was similar. It was a shift from this growth at all costs mentality to more focus around capital efficiency, profitability, use of funds in a prudent way, which frankly benefited us. Gooten is very close to achieving profitability. We'll be profitable in Q1 of next year on a go-forward basis. And so put us in a good position from a fundraising standpoint, because I think we could speak very credibly to expense discipline and how we use cash wisely. But I know it hurt us in some other conversations because we weren't asking for enough money, and funds really wanted to see a very aggressive investment growth profile. And we've always been a very efficient, lean business, and that's just not how we operate. And so it was interesting to see that dynamic play out. Some were getting more conservative, and our conservative approach actually resonated well, but other funds were still taking that growth at all costs approach.
And I think it's unfortunate, it ends up hurting the founder at the end of the day, right? Because funds are operating on these $100 million, $200 million vehicles that they can deploy in a variety of different ways. And at the end of the day, if you're successful in this versus not being successful with that growth at all costs, for them, it may be one of many, but for you is your only one. So I'm curious, how did you navigate that pressure, right, from venture capital around growth compared to what you felt were the right business goals and where you should be optimizing the business towards?
Yeah, I think we really indexed toward our management approach versus trying to be a company that a venture capital fund wanted to fund. And I think that the way we run the business with an eye toward expense discipline and frankly, really looking at sustainability of how we grow put us in that position. And frankly, learning from kind of past mistakes there. I think have a high conviction in what we're doing. We've been able to successfully fundraise, but we're not, and we know we're not in a market that's traditionally attracted the most venture capital. I disagree. I think it should attract more venture capital, but that's my own opinion. I have a fund. I can't put my money where my mouth is yet. But I think with that, it's put us in a position to say, we're going to build the business that we ultimately deliver a product that our customers want. And I think the VCs who get that and appreciate it are the ones that have really wanted to work with us. And frankly, those are the types of funds that we want to work with too, which is looking at the sustainability and differentiation in our market and how we can build something that ultimately will grow and will solve customer problems and really work backwards from that.
Absolutely. And I think that's where the magic really happens when, the funds who want to work with you are also the funds that you want to work with. And I'd like to spend a second on that, the second part of that question, which is deciding who do you want to work with. So we're going to start a little bit more open-ended and then we're going to dive a little bit deeper. But broadly speaking, who would you want to work with in an ideal world from an investor perspective?
Yeah, I think we have always looked at wanting to work with investors where there can be a really mutually beneficial two-way relationship, right? And obviously we're asking for their money. We're going to grow in return and help them achieve good returns. But our relationships where we can get introductions, sales support, really good operating advice, super beneficial to us. And it's interesting to see how funds position themselves, because I actually think the conversations that resonated with us the most are when the different partners would take time to explain, here's how we help our portfolio companies, and here's the different options available to you. We're actually a startup that really likes working with advisors and getting outside help. I know there's other founders out there who are like, hey, stay out of my business, don't tell me how to run it. I totally get that as well. We're not looking for you to tell us how to run our meetings, but I think we have a great appreciation and humility at Gooten for, we're doing this for the first time in many instances. And so bringing in someone external who's done it before, who can help us not make mistakes, is really valued as part of our culture. And so I think those funds really stood out in the process, and especially ones they were able to give specific answers or who had operators on their teams. Those were very appealing for us in terms of who we looked at partnering with.
There's one part of it around the early conversations, what, one call, two call, three call, four call, etc., meeting some founders, meeting some references, and getting as much information as you possibly can during that relatively short period of time about what that fund can truly do to
Hmm.
help you. And then there's the 99% rest of the time, the post transaction, the remaining part of the marriage, which is when they actually have to truly deliver on the value that they promised.
Hmm.
So I'm curious, what was your vetting process to figure out that after the investment, people are really going to be able to deliver the value that you were expecting them to deliver?
I don't think we had a formal vetting process. I think, frankly, it was a lot by touch and feel, and we really relied on references and introductions from existing investors and people who'd worked with funds before. That word of mouth component was huge from us, and I would say that was the same throughout the fundraising process. We leaned pretty heavily on our network and people in the community that we know who've interacted with different VCs for a lot of that advice.
And was that advice primarily about what investors to speak with and who are good people to come into this round, or was that network also being used for introductions towards those individuals as well?
It was both. It was definitely both. And so there was an element of, is this a good fund to work with? How do they like to work with founders and owners? What kind of help can they provide? Especially people who've taken money from them before. To your point of the majority of the marriage happens after the transaction. You don't get to know what that's like until you're in it. But we also leaned heavily on our network for introductions. And those warm introductions were really the ones that bore the most fruit for us, for sure.
And how much of that work was done before starting fundraising and how much was done as it's been going? Or phrased in the other sense, how much preparation really gone into figuring out who should we speak with, who are the right funds, how we're going to get into them, all those intro preparations, if you may?
To be honest, we did a good amount of prep work, but I wish we had done more. So we were still receiving introductions, doing that process as we were going. So if I could rewind the clock, I would have loved to go back and do a lot more of that up front. But I think the reality of it was I was still running my team, running the business at the same time. And so there was an element of, just bandwidth, frankly, of trying to do both things at once. But I think if I could clone myself, that's one of the things I would do. I'd go back like pre-fundraising process, take like 4 to 6 weeks and just do that. Focus on the story, the pitch deck, the preparation, getting introductions, lining everything up. It worked out in the end, but it definitely, I think, made it a little bit more painful along the way than it needed to be.
And I think this brings us to a really important question that we love asking founders, which is, do you truly believe in part-time fundraising? And if so, what are the downsides of making that choice? Being a full-time president of an organization or CEO or founder, whatever your role is at an organization, and then doing fundraising and the prep work and the outreach and all of that.
Yeah. Do I believe in it? Yes. I think it exists. I know for a lot of people, it's a reality. There doesn't feel like there's another option. Do I think it's the most effective way about it? No. I think if I could have focused only on raising capital, that would have been great as an outcome for us. The entire process, I felt like I was doing two things poorly, right? I wasn't doing everything I needed to do in the fundraising process, and I wasn't doing everything I needed to do for my team. And it was definitely exhausting. And there was operational cleanup I had to do once I was full-time back in my current role of you can only work so many hours in the day and keep yourself sane. And so there was balls that I had to let drop as I go, which was the right decision for sure for the business, but definitely difficult when you're someone who has that operator mindset of wanting to keep everything running on time.
Absolutely. People who tend to be in those roles or organizations do not tend to be the most relaxed, let everything happen as it is happen, but rather try to be in the weeds and making sure everything happens correctly. As you were going into this fundraising process at the same time as running your organization, feeling a little bit of distress and this overwhelmment of everything that has to happen, allowing some balls to drop as it just happens and it's okay. Who did you lean in, if anyone, around support, around keeping yourself sane? Did anything change around your life, your mental care, around your support ecosystem, your friends, your other founders, to allow you to go successfully through this journey?
Yeah, definitely. I think on the personal level, it was a really good lesson in what matters, just when you've got so many things going on at work in particular. So I still made it a priority to travel, spend time with my husband, some time with friends. And that was huge for me because I think there is an element of you make yourself crazy a bit in these conversations. And with the amount of rejection that inherently exists in a process like this, at least I like to think it inherently exists, right? I imagine, and what I've heard is it exists for a lot of people. You hear a lot of no, you hear a lot of kind of negative feedback. spending that time to do things that I really liked that weren't thinking about fundraising was huge for me, because then I felt like I could show up every day with a positive attitude, a fresh perspective, and be excited about what I was doing and not get too dragged down in it. So that was important. And then I also think too, one of the things I did was try to debrief with my team, with my partners in the business, share some of the feedback so it didn't feel so isolating. That's another thing I've heard from other people who've run processes. It's you're the only one in the meetings. And so it's hard sometimes because you can feel like you have a really good call or something goes really well and you might still get the no, and everybody else is like, well, wait, you said that went well. And you're like, yeah, but I can't explain, right? There's so many dynamics at play. It was helpful for me to share conversations and feedback along the way. It made it feel a little bit less isolating. And it also helped, I think, keep my team excited about the process and gave them some insights, because I think a lot of times as you're having a conversation with an investor, most of the time you're talking about where the business is going and the really big picture strategy stuff. And most people at the company, there's some exceptions, but most of us are focused on today and next week and hitting our Q2 or Q3 results and the operations element. And so it was good on both ways, right? It helped keep me grounded and remember this is what we're doing here. But at the same time, it gave me some really interesting opportunities to inform my team and talk to people about this is what I'm saying in these investor conversations, and this is why it's getting the market excited. And it's not me just saying these things. It's actually what we're planning on doing and where we want to go.
And I think this is a really important piece to get a little bit more insight from you around this perspective of communication with the rest of the team. To some extent, you want to do this by yourself because it's a roller coaster and you've built the thickest skin in the organization. You're able to resist the most rejection, are able to push through because you're the leader of the organization, and that's why you're in that opportunity. There's some middle management, some rest of other employees who may not have the same resilience, same ability to overcome these rejections, these harder times. So I'm curious, how much transparency was there at Gooten as the round was progressing? And would you have done anything differently in terms of how much you're communicating with the rest of the team?
Yeah. So, I think it's a really good question. And on the transparency side, I was never transparent. I didn't go into the mechanics of who we're talking to and the kind of fund size and investor math and returns and check and valuation. That was all pretty private and kept between me and the board and the kind of tight leadership team. But I did share with the team feedback thematically about our business and our story, because I thought that was important for them to hear of, hey, this is what I'm talking to you about in the market. This is what people are saying. Hear about how excited they are. And this is the questions that they have. Oh, and here's the things that they're potentially concerned about, because a lot of times you're talking to a person who doesn't know anything about your business or anything about your market. It's like a sales prospect, right? And so you get all this feedback, and hearing multiple times if something doesn't make sense, or if you should think about this from a competitive differentiation standpoint about what about this thing, right? It starts to say, okay, maybe we should think more about that, right? So there were actually some really good thought starters for us internally, and it prompted some broader discussions around projects we may want to take on, messaging, positioning, or even frankly, some blind spots we might have had in our business. And I'm talking mostly about the good feedback, right? Not the just, hey, thanks for your time, I'm going to pass. But where we did get more constructive feedback or engagement in meetings, I did try to share that with a broader group of people. And I think it had a good impact.
And you're saying when we got that more constructive feedback, I'm curious to understand, were you, obviously, in an ideal world, you'd receive that from every conversation, but were you actively seeking for it, or were you not able to receive that constructive feedback? Did you push back and try to get an understanding? Because we get a lot of different ways founders are approaching this. Some people may be, well, I'm going to pass. It's okay. It's okay to my side as well. We'll part ways. And some other people who are truly trying to dig to the bottom of the problem and understand why.
Yeah.
In which camp do you gravitate towards?
So for me, it would depend on the conversation, frankly. If I was getting good engagement during a call and someone was actually asking me questions, engaging with the business, and I felt like they were listening to me, then I would push if I got a no. There were calls where it's like, okay, you're pitching to a screen, right? And they just say thank you and hang up and ask you to send your entire data room. I wasn't pushing to the bottom of those no's for feedback, or frankly, sending them my data room after that kind of engagement. So I frankly trusted my judgment on that and my instinct to say, okay, this is actually somebody that was trying to get it and was trying to get there. If they put that effort in, then I would put the effort in return to try to pull feedback out of them if I felt like I didn't understand the reason for the pass. If the person on the other end of the phone hadn't put effort in, I was just going to say, thanks for your time and move on.
Got it. And I think engagement is an important piece as well. It's sometimes hidden behind closed doors because people are not in the room with you pitching. So I'm
Yeah.
trying to understand a little bit of some of your strategy, if any, around generating more engagement in those conversations. Would it be conversations in person versus virtual? Have you seen much difference between the two in terms of the engagement from the other person?
Yeah, so I did all of our meetings virtually. I didn't do any in-person pitches for a bunch of reasons. Most of the time, virtual is standard now, and it was way more efficient to get through a lot more calls without having to jump on planes constantly. I'm in Colorado, outside of Boulder. So there's a VC community here, but not huge. I think if I were in New York or San Francisco, I probably would have tried to do more in-person meetings. I was also pregnant the entire time I was fundraising. And so that factor was also really convenient for me to be able to raise and run the round from my laptop and not have to be constantly on a plane.
I do not know how we're now midway through the episode and we're just getting to this. I didn't even realize, but let's spend a second on the fact that you went through the whole fundraising journey while pregnant.
Yes.
Was this the decision of the board and yourself around the timing of the business? Was it something that was not able to be pushed around? What was your thinking around? We got to get this done before this kid sees the first light of this world? Or what went through your mind at that time?
Well, I'll tell you, it was a really great deadline for me personally because the first part of our Series A closed January 31st and my son was born February 9th. So I just slid it in right at the end. It was a good, as I joked to the board, I financed my own maternity leave. Actually, I didn't tell the board I was pregnant until October of last year. I found out I was pregnant in June. So I ran a good chunk of the process, just did what I had to do. And so it wasn't until we were fairly late along, we were already into pretty good diligence with the Touchdown and Inks team, that I told the board about my baby was coming. Yeah, it was a challenge. It was exhausting. Pregnancy is exhausting already, but fundraising while pregnant and trying to run my team and do everything, I do not want to do that again in the near future if I can avoid it.
I think here we're getting in a premiere for this podcast where it's not just a part-time journey of running your company and fundraising. It's a 3 part-time journey where you're also preparing to be a mother. So I'm curious, that deadline that was naturally set, quite frankly, to get the fundraising done, how big of an impact you think had on your drive to get the fundraising done on time?
A very big one, I think. It was really important to me to take as much of a maternity leave as possible in terms of separating for the company. I care a lot about Gooten and a lot about what we're building here, but family is number one for me. And so I knew I had the support of the board and our team to do that, but it was also really important for me to leave the company in a good place in doing so. I knew I wouldn't be able to separate mentally if that weren't the case, or practically, frankly. And so there was a very selfish motivation as well of, I want to be able to take time to spend with my new son, and I want to try to get this round wrapped up as much as possible. And if there are any loose ends, put it in a position that I can carry forward without me. I was still doing some investor calls and helping to wrap things up during my maternity leave, but the majority of the work was done. And so, that was its own little adventure, but you got to do what you got to do. And people are generally, I found, pretty supportive and nice. I talked to a couple of investors pretty soon after my son was born, and I'd apologize for not having my camera on and say, hey, sorry, I have a 3-week-old, apologize any noise in the background. And most people are like, oh my God, I can't believe you're talking to us. And I'm like, I know, it's fine. Let's just get through the meeting. Thank you. Appreciate it. Let's get to the point. But no, people were really great. But it definitely was a very good motivating factor to get the round closed.
Interesting. And have you ever felt rushed throughout that process? Usually fundraising operates with some level of artificial deadline in mind, that we need to get the money by X in order to be able to do Y and Z. And in your case was a very clear deadline of, I need to do this because after this happens, I'll be able to continue doing this and also choose to do something else. So I'm curious around your experience around how you're planning the round. And obviously things move, things get delayed, things sometimes happen faster that you would. Did you at any point worry that you may not be able to do this in time?
Yeah, I think there was definitely an urgency toward the end of last year. We got final approval on our first big term sheet in right around Christmas. And that was a stressful period just as we were going into the end of the year and making sure that got all wrapped up. And luckily it did. The round took longer than I wanted it to. So it definitely dragged out a bit. I think some of that was due to the environment for sure. But yeah, short answer to your question is yes, there were definitely times I was nervous it wasn't going to get done in time, or all of the levers of self-doubt you're going through in something like that.
And if we were to put a number to it, when you say the round took longer than you expected, what was the actual duration that you would say that the round took to get done?
I would say I spent a better part of Q2 and Q3 doing meetings and really pushing forward. Once we got into Q4, we really wanted to have the round closed by the end of the year. We were about a month late on getting everything closed and funded, which was at that point, it's easy. It was just some legal stuff that we had to get through. So we were really trying to have it done by Thanksgiving or Christmas, and then we slipped into January. So yeah, if we could have gotten it done in a quarter, that would have been ideal. But I've talked to founders and CEOs who've raised for 14 months. So I was happy to not be in that situation, and that it was really two quarters of pretty concerted effort.
Absolutely. I feel one of the benefits of this podcast and some of these questions is also unpacking a little bit of mysticism around these type of rounds and how long does it take? Because I think a lot of people have a belief that may not really be grounded in a reality around how fast these rounds really happen. And in your case, a solid track record of the business, getting closer to profitability, good metrics, etc., still taking close to 3/4 to get a Series A round done, just because that's how the fundraising market is right now. And congratulate you for raising it, right? There's also the big group of people who are unsuccessful in raising it out, even after 12, 14 months of that work. So we'd just like to spend the latter part of this episode on the people who said yes, right? And that, initial value add, the introductions that were made. Who was the first yes, and how did it come to be in this round?
Yeah, so we were introduced to Touchdown Ventures, actually via two of our existing investors. I'd say the primary introduction came from Matt Schneider over at Tech Pioneers Fund. He was insanely helpful during the entire fundraise. He and really the TPF team. I looked back before we talked at my entire tracking sheet and everything, and I'd say the lion's share of our really good intros came from Matt at TPF. So huge shout out to him. But we got in with the Touchdown team. And if you're not familiar with Touchdown, they run corporate venture capital arms for a lot of the big corporations out there. And so got connected to Will Geiger and his group and met his team, really liked them. And it was a great initial way in that led to that yes, because Will was actually familiar with our market and had looked into it, which is always awesome when that happens. I'm sure any other founder or operator can relate. So he knew what we were doing. He got it. He understood the problem that we were solving even before the initial pitch meeting. And so I was able to take his understanding and then really blow it up to say, this is how we're doing it differently and why it's really cool. And then he actually was able to get us multiple different introductions within his group to different corporate VCs. So really nice from an efficiency standpoint for the person that was running the round. Like I pretty much just had to deal with Will and his team, and I didn't have to repeat myself all the time because the Touchdown team facilitated all of the diligence, and it was just doing diligence with one group. But then they got you opportunities to meet with different corporate VCs. And so ultimately, the conversations with the Inks International team that Touchdown works with progressed the fastest, and we're getting more serious. And so I ended up presenting. They had a kind of a thought leadership day where Inks Corporate was having a bunch of different people come in across the industry, talk about trends. And Will and the Touchdown team asked if I could come and present about Gooten. So I got the opportunity to present to pretty much the entire Inks global leadership team. They're a huge multinational corporation. So all the decision makers in the fundraising process, all the business heads. It was a gigantic Zoom meeting that I was dialing into. And I think that was a big turning point because we were able to get the broader group really excited about what we were doing. And from there, things started going really fast. And so I think that level of exposure and buy-in was huge for us.
So the archetypical tipping point, right? At the moment where things start to be a little bit easier than they were before. And it's interesting to hear that the primary introductions were actually made by investors. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on the best types of introductions to get into new funds. A lot of people are talking about warm introductions and get a warm introduction. Never send a cold email. Warm introductions come in a lot of variety of ways. So I'm curious, what were the most effective for you?
Yeah, so the most effective ones were either an existing investor or someone very close to our business actually talked to the fund, did the short pitch on behalf of us. A lot of times those meetings happened in person or over a call. It was more than an email. So they really teed us up well and got the receiving party for the intro excited about Gooten. And then they followed it up with an email. And so the Touchdown introduction came after Matt had a beer with Will Geiger. They'd been talking about a bunch of stuff. Matt brought up Gooten, talked to Will about Gooten. He was able to answer questions on the fly. And then Will said, that'd be great. I'd love to meet Maddy and meet the team. And so all of the conversations really that went the furthest for us came as a result of something like that. Though I will say I did some cold outreach and it wasn't a total non-starter. They didn't write the checks ultimately, but actually had a couple of pretty good conversations as a result of kind of cold intros, either that I had made or that had come inbound. I think that actually positively shifted my perception, because I would have probably been in the camp of like cold intros, not worth your time, but it didn't get the round done, but still led to some pretty decent meetings.
Were there any of those people who end up investing at all, or was there no checks whatsoever from the cold?
No
channels?
Checks from the cold. Nope.
Okay, interesting. But there's still some value around the people that you met, around the conversation that you had, around potential introductions that they made, right, to customers, suppliers, other investors, etc.
Yeah, there's actually one cold intro that the no was a stage check size fit that we've stayed in touch with, that we actually just had coffees with in New York, that we're meeting again in San Francisco because they're interested in a potential B if we decide to go raise that. And that was totally cold. So actually some decent relationships that have come out of those meetings, which has been great.
And a perfect tee for my last question before we jump into the rapid fire, which is, keeping in touch, right? Like preparing for the B. Your thoughts around investor updates, around best ways to actually keep those investors engaged that maybe said no now because of the stage, but you may want them at the B. What's your process around your investor relations function, both current investors and prospective investors for the next round?
Yeah, so our current investors, we typically keep updated on the business every 4 to 6 weeks. We have, most of our major investors have board seats, and then we have some other investors who have board observer seats. And so the board meetings, we typically do those quarterly, and those are a really good function to get pre-room materials out. And then we always do solo one-on-one board calls with everyone on the board ahead of those meetings, just to make sure that we're getting anything that the board wants to hear about us, specifically addressing one-on-one feedback, that kind of stuff. So that's really how we manage kind of the current investor group, at least for our major participants and shareholders. For new investors, I'll admit it's something that we're trying to get better at. We've started using a CRM more diligently in terms of maintaining investor contacts, adding notes, tracking all of our engagements there, because then we can use automated task follow-ups and reminders and get more organized. I tracked most of the process through Google Sheets, and I don't want to do that again. Doing it now through an actual CRM. So my goal is to, especially where we had really good positive engagements, try to engage with investors at least once a quarter or a couple times a year, just to talk about how the business is going. But I think more realistically, doing event travel, doing for client visits. I'm in New York, San Francisco, a lot of the major markets relatively frequently. And so trying to be a lot more proactive. If I'm going to be in San Francisco in October for an event, reaching out, spending a few extra days, trying to get some coffee meetings with people that I'd met over the phone to try to build those relationships a little bit easier.
And it's interesting that you say that, right? Because at the beginning of the episode, we talked about virtual and pitching everybody for efficiency around Zoom and Google Meets. But then we're talking about actually being in New York and being in San Francisco and building that relationship in person. Would you say that that relationship with time must have some in-person component for that relationship to be developed, whereas maybe the fundraising period can be handled online?
Yeah, I think so. I said that from the standpoint of it worked and it was efficient. I could design my ideal process. I would have loved to have met everyone in person beforehand, not needed capital, go back to them virtually and be able to do those meetings. So I'm trying to do that in advance of another round, build the relationships in person, and then hopefully be able to fundraise virtually again, because that was great from kind of an efficiency and quality of life standpoint. When it's already so busy, if I had been trying to travel at the same time, that would have been really hard. But I do think relationship building, there's a lot of benefit to seeing people and sitting down face to face.
That would have been the fourth part-time job of traveler on top of expecting mother and full-time president and fundraising person.
I couldn't do anymore. I was on 65 flights last year already. So I can't wrap my brain around what additional travel for fundraising would have looked like. And that was for running the company and client visits and vendor visits. And we were in offsite. So I already had enough travel on my plate. I wasn't trying to add anymore.
I bet. This is a great segue into the last part of the episode. A few questions, non-business related necessarily, just for people to get a chance to know Maddy a little bit better. And that's actually our very first question always, which is, what is one thing that you would say most people don't know about you that you would like more people to be aware of?
Oh, that's a great question. Things that people don't know about me. I know it's supposed to be rapid fire. I'm supposed to give you a faster answer. I love to read. I don't talk about that very often, but I do really like reading. I love being alone. I think I come across as an extrovert at work. I'm in sales. I work with people. I talk to investors all the time, but I actually love being alone. I love traveling alone and reading.
Interesting. Which is a recent book that recently shaped the way you're viewing the world, your industry, or the world more broadly.
So potentially unpopular opinion, I really don't like reading business books. I know I'm supposed to, given my title and focus at work, but reading for me is entertainment and I don't want to think about work. So I mostly read fiction. And so for me, it's a lot more about separating and letting my mind take a break from trying to think about how to change the world via print-on-demand software. But I would say best book I've read recently, I read a book called In 5 Years. It's like a romance novel. It was very well written. I liked that. So yeah, I like to read fun stuff like that, fiction mostly. So right now I am reading The Challenger Sale because we are doing an offsite book club and it's a great sales book so far. So it might change my opinion on business reading for a short period of time.
Interesting. We're going to have to ask this question again after you raise your Series B and you're back on the podcast.
Yes.
And see if anything changed. Penultimate question, a person that you look up most to recently or over your time and career that you've consistently looked up to?
My dad, for sure.
Why?
So I think my dad, he's worked in startups his whole life. That's actually how I got interested in working at a startup. I was at BlackRock prior to working at Gooten, so pretty much the opposite of a 20-person startup in Manhattan. But he's really the person that inspired me to get involved in the startup world, taught me, I think, a great ethic around building and team building and rolling up your sleeves and the satisfaction in creating something with a group of people, which is really what we're doing here. We're creating a solution. So I have a lot to thank him for that. And he's still in a startup. He's on his second or third exit working for the company that's acquired them. And so I call him all of the time because he's so far ahead of me and everything that he's gone through in terms of navigating this ecosystem. He's an awesome role model and a wealth of advice in terms of navigating this crazy world that we're in.
Sounds like a great person to have on the next episode of the Fundraising Debrief if you're willing to sponsor the introduction.
Of course, yes.
But our last question, which is a long-standing tradition at our firm, and it's been something that we carried on throughout our lives, which is taking a moment of gratitude at the end of every conversation. Wanted to bring that spirit into the podcast as well. As we're ending this episode, one person that you would like to say thank you.
Yeah, that's an easy one. So my gratitude is actually to Gooten CEO Brian Rainey. I am here today because of him. I wouldn't be in my current position or even at this company if it weren't for Brian. And I get to come and I'm talking on a podcast to you about this fundraising success. And I get the pleasure and the trust of our team and our board to be the face of a lot of these conversations. But I wouldn't be here without my partner, who is Brian. And I think we make a great team. And I'm very grateful for him because as much as I like to give him a hard time, because he really does drive me crazy most days in a good way, it's really awesome to work with someone that you trust, that you care about, that you're friends with, that you learn a lot from. So he's an awesome partner. And Gooten and myself wouldn't exist without him.
It sounds like a great co-founder situation. Maddy, such a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much. I think this has been incredibly enlightening for myself as well, from all your wealth of advice around the fundraising. And I'm certain a lot of people are going to get a lot of insights and benefits from listening to this. Super excited to hear what people have to say about this conversation. And thank you once again for joining us. And we do hope to see you again in a year or so discussing your successful Series B round.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for having me. Excited to talk about Series B, or you can come back and talk to me about profitability and not having to raise capital again, because both sound just as appealing, honestly. Good paths forward.
Indeed. That may be a third podcast idea on profitable startups.
There we go.
Thank you, Maddy.
All right. Thanks, Vlad. Good to meet you.
What a great conversation. If you enjoyed it, make sure to like and subscribe to our podcast and be on the lookout for a new episode in 2 weeks as we interview another amazing startup founder and debrief their successful fundraising story. This podcast was made possible by Flowlie. If you're currently fundraising or planning to do so in the near future, create a free account today on Flowlie at flowlie.com. That's FLOWLIE.com. And get access to an investor database curated just for you and powerful deck sharing capabilities with advanced access and engagement tracking. Are you ready to take your fundraising journey to the next level and join thousands of founders across the globe who use the platform every single day? Find the discount code in the show notes and sign up today. That's it for today's episode. See you next time.